A study on the working conditions of domestic workers in the wealthy northern suburbs of Johannesburg has revealed that they often face a lot of problems, including inadequate living conditions, discriminatory policies and restricted access to facilities. Let's talk now about the study with Annabel Fenton, who conducted the research. In fact, Annabel, a happy Workers' Day to you. Thank you so much for making time to speak to us this evening. Let's start with the focus of your research and why this was such an area of interest for you.
Yes, sure. Thanks for having me. So my research specifically focused on apartment buildings in Killarney, Illovo and Rosebank. And these buildings were built during apartheid and have a top floor where domestic servants live. And they were built during apartheid and are one of those legacies that are still in place. And in a lot of cases, the domestic quarters are in poor conditions, and there's discriminatory rules as well that domestic workers have to follow, which aren't applicable to other wealthier residents within the same building. And all of this research came to light during COVID, because I think that was a time where people were finally turning inwards and understanding where they were living and the people they were living around, even though they hadn't necessarily seen them before. And there were a lot of issues, obviously, as well during COVID in terms of access and monitoring domestic workers' movements as well within these buildings.
And what you're highlighting puts a lot of pressure, does it not, on the domestic workers? Because on one hand, these are people who earn very little. Some of them are paid below what the national minimum wage says they should be earning. The places of work are far, and that's why some of them will then find themselves living in these quarters in the first place. So they basically are stuck between a rock and a hard place, in a sense.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's one of the complexities of the apartheid legacy, is that it's not a case where we can just say, do away with all of the domestic quarters and turn the rooms into storage rooms, like a few buildings in Illovo are doing. But instead of that, we have to consider the fact that a lot of the domestic workers that I spoke to found this to be a very convenient solution. They're paying 500 Rand a month for a room, whereas when they were commuting from places like Soweto and Alex, they were paying something up to 1,400 Rand a month. So it's not necessarily a case of just kicking domestic workers out of these quarters. That'll just further ingrain the spatial inequality that we see in South Africa, but maybe more about consulting domestic workers living in these spaces about what they need, what they want, and trying to make sure that all of the rules that are enforced are upholding their constitutional rights rather than restricting them. Because at the moment, the restrictions are focusing on things like their movements. There's noise discrimination clauses as well. And some workers can't even have their children come visit them.
And is it a case then of building managers, landlords simply enforcing their rules, or an outright deliberate attempt to suppress and perhaps even violate the rights of these domestic workers?
I think it varied. Well, we found that it varied from building to building. So in some cases, it was kind of body corporate rules that were inherited from apartheid that had these discriminatory rules in place and hadn't changed, and the body corporate trustees and building managers were enforcing them just based on that. But we also saw in other cases that in buildings, even where there weren't any written rules, there was still discrimination taking place. An example that we found was in one building in Rosebank. The gardener of the building spent his Christmas at the pool, and in the middle of his Christmas celebration was told that he had to leave. But actually that building itself didn't have any written rules about the whereabouts of the domestic quarter residents.
What recourse then is there for people such as the gardener in such a situation?
Well, that's the thing that we really need to look into, because the problem at the moment is that there's no regulation of the sector. It's one of the most difficult sectors in South Africa to regulate. So the more visibility that this issue gets, the more people know, such as the gardener, can advocate for their rights and seek proper legal support, knowing that they have been discriminated against. But I think there's also a responsibility on government and bodies such as CSOS to actually look at the rules that are being logged and seeing whether they are or aren't discriminatory, and find some way to have a blanket standard of living for domestic quarter residents.
I ask you about recourse, but I also am curious about the extent to which these landlords, building managers are, let's say, abusing these domestic workers, gardeners, etc., precisely because they know they're dealing with people who may not have a certain level of education and knowledge of their rights, etc., who they know don't even know who to go to if they feel that they're being disadvantaged and taken for a ride.
Yeah, definitely. And I found that one of the domestic workers that I spoke to in Killarney, she said that she felt like she was living in a prison. As I mentioned, her children weren't allowed to visit, and, you know, she had a curfew and things like that. And then my kind of logical, you know, me being like an ignorant, privileged white person, was then to ask, well, why didn't you just join a union and advocate for your rights? And she told me that she's very skeptical of unions and, you know, finds that she could even be fired if her employer finds out that she's part of a union. So the problem with discrimination like this as well is that those who are most vulnerable and most affected are also the ones that are least likely to advocate for their rights.
But added to that, there's the layer in South Africa's domestic work mix in terms of the labour that's available, where many of the people who work in people's homes are in fact in the country illegally at times, or from neighbouring SADC countries where even if they do have the right documentation, they too are so desperate that they don't want to cause trouble, quote unquote.
Yes, definitely. That's very true. And I think also because unemployment is so high in South Africa that, and, you know, it's a fairly medium skilled job, there are so many other people that could replace domestic workers. So they are in this precarious living condition. And I think the way to address that really is by trying to regulate the sector a bit more closely and regulate how domestic workers are treated, regardless of their employment status and how formal that is.
But how do you begin to regulate, for example, and how much of the problem would be addressed by paying them more?
I mean, it's a difficult one, and I think something that we've been struggling with in this country since the end of apartheid. I think, as I mentioned, in terms of regulation, it starts with the rules. So if the rules written down are discriminatory, then that's going to lead to further discrimination. So again, if we have interventions from CSOS and other body corporate level to improve the rules and make sure those aren't discriminatory, and then have oversight on a building level of treatment happening within those spaces. I think also the more that advocacy organizations, so the Easily Domestic Workers Alliance, are doing a lot of advocacy around this issue, the more that they bring cases like this to courts and challenge the discrimination taking place, I think that also then tries to change the norm in terms of what treatment domestic workers are receiving.
Annabel Fenton, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.